Stop grinding your jaw. A Zen sleep story for anger. Right now, there is a thick, rough heat localized on the outer sides of your jaw joints, pulling down into the large side muscles of your neck. An unyielding physical clenching that flares up every time your thoughts attempt to settle. It is the specific somatic residue of internal litigation. The exhausting weight carried by someone who spends their late night hours, replaying unfinished confrontations and preparing imaginary speeches to people who will never understand. You are experiencing the deep, hot friction of trying to prove a point to an adversary who refuses to validate your truth, leaving your physical muscles working all night to grind down an old grievance that remains entirely unaffected by your effort. Your jaw handles the phantom tension of 100 unspoken arguments tonight, holding a dry, coarse heat where a cool, peaceful rest should live. The immediate sanctuary of your late night room is adjusting to the dark hours, offering a damp, cool shelter where the impulse to defend your position can be dropped completely. Outside, the steady rhythm of an early autumn rain washes across the stone mountain terraces, filling the night with the clean, mineral aroma of wet granite and the faint, sweet scent of crushed buckwheat hulls drifting from a nearby garden shed. Inside, the subtle, rhythmic hiss of a small rushlight burning in a shallow oil dish on a low slate shelf provides an unhurried focal point for the senses, while the thick, indigottied hemp mat beneath your upper body absorbs the direct pressure of your shoulder blades. The cool, unrefined weave of the fabric pressing against the back of your neck begins to match the stillness of the floorboards, gently inviting the tight, overworked muscles surrounding your jaw joints to cease their internal grinding. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting your skull yield completely to the firm, supportive ground, allowing the unconvincing explanations of your past interactions to remain unuttered in the shadows. You are not broken, dear friend. What you are feeling in this thick, hot restriction around your jaw and neck is not failure, nor is it proof that your capacity for genuine internal clarity has been permanently ruined, because you cannot force your mind to let go of the argument. The profound exhaustion you carry tonight is a natural baseline, a stark indication that your physical body is wisely refusing to find a resolution out of thin air. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and we will not demand that you immediately find the grace to forgive or the energy to appreciate the people who misunderstood you. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, and you do not need to win the argument before you are permitted to let your jaw drop open. Right now, nothing is required of you now, and you are safe enough to soften. There is a startling, liberating paradox embedded within Buddhist wisdom that meets this specific interpersonal friction with an unexpected direct truth. We live under the persistent illusion that true emotional resolution means achieving a conceptual victory, believing that if we can only assemble the perfect sequence of logical points, we will finally secure our safety and prove the absolute rightness of our perspective. We treat our thoughts as a courtroom, hoping that our internal litigation will eventually force the adversary to agree with our value. But the profound insight of the Zen tradition reveals that suffering does not arise because the other person holds a mistaken view. The agony takes root when the mind insists on keeping the heavy grinding tools in motion, attempting to process a hard, dry grievance through pure, exhausting friction. This is the truth of the sandstone mortar. When a heavy stone grinding bowl draws its heavy pestle across dry corners without any grain, the intense contact begins to shed stone dust into the vessel, ruining the flour through its own worn texture. The suffering is not the presence of the blemish, but the violent grinding of the stone. True peace is not the conversion of the enemy. It is the natural, unforced realization that you can drop the pestle entirely. Maybe you have felt this too, the sudden, terrifying realization at midnight that the person you are arguing with in your thoughts is sleeping peacefully miles away, completely unaware of the immense energy you are spending to defeat them. The mind turns inward, transforming this deep energetic friction into an intense personal indictment, whispering that because your jaw is tight, you are fundamentally small-minded, aggressive, and trapped by your own pride. This is the mechanism that adds a second wound to the original sorrow of your conflict. The first pain is simply the raw, interpersonal reality of a world where people are blind to their own impact, viewpoints clash, and misunderstandings happen without checking our limits. The second pain is the cruel judgment you strike against your own neck, declaring that you are ruined simply because your mind refuses to be quiet. But the unpolished sandstone does not apologize to the kitchen for its rough grain, and the volcanic pumice does not dictate the depth of the dark mountain valley. The heat you track through your jaw joints is merely a temporary residue of old friction, completely unable to diminish the deep, untroubled awareness that is cradling your body tonight. In a few moments, our attention will journey toward a small, damp mountain temple kitchen during an early autumn rain, where a young cook sat staring at a heavy stone pestle covered in gray granite dust, feeling the exact same thick, rough heat that is weighing down your neck right now. But before we enter that silent, wet landscape, allow your awareness to notice the physical weight of your head. Let the deep spaces between your ears and your shoulders expand outward. Let the lungs settle down without any restriction, and let the small muscles beneath your tongue release their tight coordination. You do not need to force anything tonight, and you do not have to guarantee that your inner clarity will return before the morning arrives. The world will manage its own disputes without your frantic internal litigation for the next few hours, and every unsaid text, every imaginary defense speech, and every rough mortar can remain completely suspended in the dark. We spend so much of our life treating our perspective as a fortress that must always be defended against the ignorance of others, believing that if we allow a single misconception to stand, we will be left completely unprotected in the world. We evaluate our security by the alignment of external opinions, and then we wonder why our inner core feels so charred and thinned when the friction runs out. But the vast mountain terrace does not feel a shred of guilt for remaining flat beneath the midnight rain, and the unworked granite does not apologize to the builder for sitting silent in the mud. The suffering you hold does not come from the simple fact that you were misunderstood. It grows from the current resistance that refuses to let the issue remain unsettled without demanding that your core immediately ignite itself out of shame. Let another breath arrive naturally, without you needing to measure its length or direct its depth. Let it fill the spaces behind your jaw joints, down through the sides of your neck, and deep into the very center of your back. You are nothing more than a living form resting in a quiet room, completely free from the metrics, justifications, and arguments of the waking world. In the deep silence that is growing between us, the cool mountain air is moving through the wet stone outside, requiring no intellectual victories and demanding no perfect agreements before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the hemp against your skin as we prepare to step onto the damp earthen floor of the temple kitchen, where the keeper of the grain is waiting to show us how to let the pestle rest. High on the northern slope of the ridge, where the dark cedar trees caught the first chill of the autumn downpour, the monastery kitchen sat embedded into the side of the living cliff. The air within this low-ceilinged room always carried the specific scent of damp granite, cold ash, and the sharp, dry powder of pulverized stone that drifted from the heavy milling tools. In this damp space worked Genji, a young temple cook, whose daily duty was to grind the raw grains for the morning gruel. Genji moved around the workspace with a stiff, defensive tightness, his head tilted slightly downward, carrying a persistent, thick heat that locked the outer corners of his jaw joints and pulled heavily down the sides of his neck. For 2 days, Genji had been trapped in a private, furious storm of the mind, his thoughts locked in a continuous internal litigation over an encounter with a merchant from the valley who had accused the monastery of shortchanging the summer harvest barter. The merchant had spoken with a smug, unyielding certainty, cutting off Genji's explanations before they could be fully voiced, leaving the young cook standing on the public path, feeling completely misunderstood and raw with a sense of deep injustice. Genji had spent the subsequent nights lying wide awake on his narrow pallet, his teeth grinding together in the dark as he constructed flawless, devastating counter-arguments he wished he had spoken, mentally cross-examining the merchant over and over until his neck muscles felt like hot iron bands. He treated his morning duties as an arena to exhaust his unspoken anger, lifting the heavy kitchen implements with an aggressive precision. Yet his internal focus remained entirely chained to that valley market stalls, desperately trying to force an imaginary version of the adversary to finally admit the truth. The keeper of the monastery's granary was Elder Kanto, an old monk whose skin resembled the deeply grooved surface of an ancient river boulder, and whose movements possessed the slow, unhurried weight of a stone roller sliding across grain. Kanto did not deliver lengthy discourses on the nature of right and wrong, spending his quiet hours inspecting the storage bins and maintaining the heavy stone implements used by the kitchen attendants. He had been silently tracking the progressive hardening of Genji's posture, noting the dry, rhythmic screech coming from the preparation corner, where the young cook had been working since the early rain began. On an afternoon when the mist had settled so deeply into the mountain crevices that the terrace outside the door completely disappeared from view, Kanto walked over to the low wooden bench where Genji was working. The room was perfectly silent, save for the steady, dull roar of the water rushing through the stone drainage channels outside. On the center of the dark slate table rested a heavy sandstone mortar, a large, rough grinding bowl that had been used for generations to mill the toughest mountain grains. Genji was gripping a heavy, rough stone pestle covered in gray granite dust, his knuckles white and his jaw clenched as he swung the stone tool in a violent, dry circle against the empty bottom of the basin. The young cook stopped his movements as the elder approached, his arms remaining locked, the thick heat behind his jaw joints intensifying as he braced for a correction. Genji assumed the old granary keeper was about to scold him for working too loudly or for wasting time before the evening meal bell, his internal thoughts instantly rising to justify the frantic energy behind his labor. Elder Kanto did not look at the empty flour bins, and he did not ask about the evening menu. Instead, he reached out his rough hand, placed it gently over Genji's white knuckles on the handle of the pestle, and asked the young man to look closely at what was actually being produced inside the stone bowl. Genji looked down into the hollow of the sandstone mortar, his breath catching in his throat with a sudden, painful wave of emotional recognition. As the dust settled under the dim oil light, the basin held no buckwheat, no barley, and no rye because he had been swinging the tool against the empty vessel out of pure internal distraction. The intense, dry friction had begun to shave away the very walls of the mortar, leaving nothing but a thick, gray layer of useless granite dust that would spoil any food placed within it. He looked up at the old monk, his voice tight and cracked with an unspent, bitter sorrow as he confessed that he had spent the whole day grinding the empty stone, his mind so consumed by the image of the valley merchant that he had completely ruined the vessel. He admitted, his neck muscles tightening against the weight of his vulnerability, that his own jaw and head felt exactly like this dry mortar, a hot, gritty space where he had been grinding his own physical energy against an old confrontation, leaving his system entirely raw, exhausted, and filled with dust. The old granary keeper took the heavy stone pestle from Genji's hands, laid it quietly on the dark slate table, and reached for a wooden ladle filled with cool, dark mountain water from a bucket near the wall. Without using any force, Kanto poured the water directly into the dry, dusty sandstone bowl, watching the gray powder instantly soften, dissolve, and lose its rough grit under the still, clear surface of the liquid. The elder looked at the young cook and told him that the torment of the mortar was not the hardness of the granite or the behavior of the valley merchant, but the delusion that a dry stone can achieve peace by grinding harder against itself. Kanto pointed out that the rough friction did not touch the adversary. 3 miles down the mountain, it only ruined the tool that was meant to prepare the nourishment for the night. The suffocating heat Genji carried did not live in the merchant's perspective. It grew entirely from his own exhausting habit of keeping the pestle in motion, refusing to let the stone go silent until he could force an imaginary victory out of the past. Genji stood perfectly still on the damp earthen floor, the clean, mineral scent of the wet stone and the quiet sound of the settling water moving deep into his senses as his jaw joints slowly began to release their defensive lock. For the first time since the dispute, the rigid, hot constriction running down the side of his neck began to lose its edge, allowing a deep, unhurried breath to reach the base of his lungs. He looked at the perfectly flat, wet surface of the sandstone basin, realizing that the conceptual rightness he had been trying to extract from the past was an illusion. The argument was already over, and the only thing keeping the heat alive was his own refusal to set the tool down on the bench. Slowly, the heavy, unhurried stillness of that damp temple kitchen moves into the quiet space of your own dark room tonight, letting the image of the resting stone mirror the exact condition of your own overworked mind. You have been lying awake, replaying the confrontations that cannot be altered, measuring the depth of the hot restriction inside your jaw, and letting the ignorance of those who misunderstood you convince you that your spirit is permanently trapped. You have believed that because you cannot force an agreement, your actual capacity to find peace has been destroyed. But the deep, unmeasured reservoir of your true nature remains completely intact, entirely separate from the dust that has gathered in the friction. Let the pestle rest on the table, allowing your awareness to settle into the wide, peaceful depth of this single hour. This reflection on the empty sandstone mortar and the rain-drenched temple kitchen is not telling us to stop feeling the sharp sting of being falsely accused, nor is it asking us to become cold, unyielding granite blocks that remain completely unbothered when someone handles our good intentions with a dismissive or defensive arrogance. It is not an invitation to build a state of forced detachment where we pretend that facing an unfair judgment or carrying a heavy unfinished litigation does not leave a genuine thick ache inside our physical jaw joints. Instead, it is showing us something quieter, a gentle shift in internal positioning that allows us to witness the misaligned viewpoints of our life without allowing that external friction to grind our own foundation into dust. The persistent, rough heat that locks the sides of your neck tonight does not persist simply because a confrontation took place on the path. The deepest suffering takes root when the mind insists on holding that unresolved exchange as an ongoing emergency that must be fought until a victory is extracted. When we look at this Latinite litigation through the clear, simple lens of Buddhist insight, we see that what we often describe as attachment is actually that stubborn, defensive clenching at the base of the skull that declares, until I can see my absolute rightness perfectly acknowledged and completely validated by the adversary, my entire system must remain in a state of active, rigid warfare. It is the exhausting habit of locking our fundamental stability into the changing metrics of another person's ignorance, desperately trying to swing the heavy pestle of our thoughts just to convince ourselves that we are safe from erasure. We treat our perspective as if it were a fortress that must never show a single vulnerability to a critic, and when an encounter leaves us raw, we believe our actual spirit has been compromised. This is the modern reality of craving. It is the frantic, Latinite looping that keeps us mentally anticipating the next defensive speech or replaying past arguments, hoping that one more round of imagined litigation will somehow secure our sanctuary and save us from the void. But a heavy piece of stone scraped against an empty basin cannot dictate the depth of the wide mountain valley. No matter how many times you replay the merchant's dismissive tone against the dark ceiling of your room, the hard interaction has already ended. The path has already emptied. The words have already vanished into the autumn mist. When we lie awake burning our vital energy to maintain these old definitions, we are participating in a quiet internal process that adds a second wound to the first. The first wound is simply the raw, interpersonal reality of a changing world where people are blind to their own impact, perspectives diverge, and misunderstandings occur without checking our boundaries. These experiences are genuinely heavy, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable weather of human existence. The second wound, however, is the one we strike against our own neck when our thoughts turn inward and declare, because your truth was not validated by your adversary, you are permanently diminished, unprotected, and ruined. Let this quiet realization sit directly next to the thick, hot restriction in the outer sides of your jaw joints right now. Consider what happens when we replace that desperate desire for a conceptual victory with simple, spacious awareness. This quality of mind is not a complex discipline that you must perform perfectly before you are permitted to rest your head. It is simply the capacity to look directly at the empty basin of your past conflicts, without allowing that grit to dictate the width of your current breath. It is the ability to observe the rigid heat in your neck, to label it gently as the old habit of defining yourself by the argument, and to recognize that the stone dust belongs entirely to the dry friction, not to the wide, uncarved landscape that is holding you tonight. When you allow the sandstone mortar to rest on the slate bench without continuously grinding the empty corners with your thoughts, you stop feeding the heat that keeps your skull joints raw. You let the dispute exist in the past while you remain open in the present room. Impermanence, when translated into the immediate texture of your evening rest, becomes an immense sanctuary for an overworked heart. It acts as a gentle reminder that the monumental injustice you felt was not a solid, eternal block trapped inside your identity. That grand confrontation was a temporary arrangement of form that belonged to a specific hour. It has no physical power to reach into the dark and diminish the deep, untroubled awareness that is watching it tonight. The body lying in this room is entirely separate from those unsaid defenses, its jaw capable of dropping into a clean, ancient rhythm that has never been restricted by the boundaries of a market stall. You do not have to force your current muscles to maintain a defensive guard just to protect a viewpoint that has already returned to the silence of the mountainside. True letting go does not mean you abandon your care for what is fair, or that you pretend the misunderstanding did not feel heavy. It means you stop using the validation of the other person as a metric to determine whether you are permitted to take a full, unhurried breath in the dark. It means you acknowledge the dry, gritty channels of your past, look at the wreckage with a soft, non-judgmental eye, and then allow the pestle to drop where it wills without demanding that your core become smooth before you are allowed to sleep. When you drop the expectation that your life must always hold an intact victory for the world to see, you discover that true compassion is the willingness to stand in your own empty center and hold your vulnerable frame with a tenderness that requires no external return. Right now, notice how effortlessly your body is managing its own survival in the dark, completely unconcerned with the heavy words you tried to weigh during the daylight hours. Your pulse does not check the status of your arguments before it agrees to warm your limbs, and your lungs do not demand an intact agreement from the valley before they open to receive the cool night breeze. You are already being sustained by a deep, natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of human litigation, resting securely within a night that requires no conceptual rightness before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the hemp against your skin as we prepare to step onto the cool dirt floor of the stonecarver's shed, where the mason is waiting to show us the nature of the space that remains when the grinding is laid down. If it feels right, let your attention gather very gently right along the outer edges of your jaw joints, arriving at the exact physical parameters where that thick, rough heat has been anchoring its energy. There is no need to actively push the memory of the unfair judgment away, and there is no requirement to make your mind completely quiet by force. Simply notice the physical texture of the restriction, observing the stubborn hot knot behind your skull base, as if you were merely looking at a heavy, dry sandstone mortar resting on a dark slate workbench without any urgency to wipe the grit or force the stone walls to become smooth. As you rest here in the deep, indigo-shadowed stillness of the late evening hour, perhaps you can invite a slow wave of softening to move through the deep muscles of your face. Your jaw hinges, and the sides of your neck let the small, rigid fibers surrounding your lower jaw drop their protective brace, allowing the teeth to separate naturally, and let your upper neck feel wide, as if it were dissolving into the cool, damp earth beneath your frame. There is no pressure to achieve a sudden state of profound emotional healing in this moment, and even just noticing that your internal muscles still feel tight, guarded, or full of dry friction is entirely enough. You are simply taking stock of your own internal landscape, acknowledging where the mind has been buckle-strapping its armor against the vast uncertainty of an unresolved dispute. Right now, let the specific memory of that unfinished confrontation float up into your awareness perhaps, the exact moment where your words were cut off, The exhaustion of watching your explanations hang without an answer, or the general, heavy worry that you will be permanently cut off from safety if anyone sees the uncorrected space in your history. Do not try to analyze the validity of the past argument, and do not try to fix the perception of the person who walked away from the path. Instead, just name the emotional pattern that is currently tightening across your neck. You might say to yourself, very quietly, "This is the habit of grinding the empty mortar," or "This is the old defensive heat trying to force the stone to yield." Just by naming it, you are stepping out of the dark, urgent internal courtroom and standing beside Elder Canto in the misty kitchen, looking at the gray dust from a place of unhurried safety. Imagine that your unsaid words are like that heavy, rough stone pestle, its natural texture having become hardened and unyielding from hours of continuous friction. Look at its fractured shape in your mind's eye. See how many times your thoughts have gripped that rough material today, fixing your sight entirely upon the spent attachment, letting that hot restriction convince you that your true nature has been permanently ruined. In this quiet space, if it feels comfortable, imagine taking that heavy, burning need to secure a conceptual victory, that persistent wish to hide your natural vulnerability, and allowing it to rest quietly inside the hollow, dry layers of the sandstone bowl. You do not have to build a fortress across the valley with your exhaustion, and you do not have to make the other person understand. You are simply setting the tool down on the slate while you step back into your own breathing body. Watch what happens to the internal space across your jaw joints as you let the responsibility sit outside of your identity. Perhaps the image of the dry, dusty vessel begins to change its texture under the steady, cool sweep of the mountain rain. Imagine a clean, dark stream of mountain water slowly pouring into the hollow of the mortar, watching the gray dust instantly soften, dissolve, and lose its rough grit under the still, clear surface of the liquid. The faint, clean scent of wet granite rises from the lower path, filling the room with a stable, grounded quality that has nothing to do with the forced explanation. The mountain does not collapse, and the floorboards remain completely solid beneath your weight, holding their space with absolute security. The dust on the bench does not diminish the capacity of the wood to remain steady. It is simply a layer of sand in the room, entirely separate from the deep, unmeasured valley that is holding you tonight. If your thoughts begin to drift back toward the market stalls, the expectations of the valley merchant, or the arguments you wish you could rewrite to prove your absolute worth, you can return to the simple, rhythmic expansion of your lower lungs whenever you are ready. There is no failure in a mind that wanders back to its wreckage. The slow hiss of the rushlight outside the window pane does not apologize for moving in the dark, and your memories are no different from that natural occurrence. They are simply configurations resting in your vast, open hall of awareness, and they cannot permanently break your true self unless you choose to believe that you are the dry sandstone mortar. Nothing needs to be forced tonight, dear friend. You are not required to empty your heart of its friction through an act of sheer will. And you do not have to guarantee that your path will feel clear before the morning light arrives. You are simply a living form, letting the heavy, unalterable roles of the defender rest on the table, while the unmoving dark continues to cradle your center, leaving your inner vault wide, unanchored, and deeply at peace. Further along the rocky spine of the upper cliffs, where the mountain path narrowed into a ledge overlooking the vast mist-filled chasm, a quiet stonecarver's shed sat exposed to the elements. The air within this cedar-framed shelter always held the specific scent of split flint, cold pine needles, and the clean mineral dust of shaved basalt. In this isolated workspace lived Shaku, an advanced apprentice stonemason who spent his seasons dressing the structural lintels for the mountain terraces. Shaku worked with a rigid, frantic intensity, the outer boundaries of his jaw joints locked tight, and his breathing confined to the shallowest chambers of his upper chest. For many days, Shaku had been consumed by a fierce, quiet internal war over a stone tablet he had been carving for a village patron, which had been returned to the shop with a dismissive note claiming the grain was uneven and the inscription lacked symmetry. The accusation had struck deeply against Shaku's sense of craft, cutting straight through his professional pride and leaving him with a hot, raw urge to defend the perfection of his chisel work. Instead of putting the slab aside, Shaku had dragged the volcanic stone back onto his heavy cedar trestle, gripping a flat piece of rough volcanic pumice to violently grind down the perceived blemish. Working through the freezing nights until his forearms throbbed with strain, he treated every pass of the pumice as a furious, silent argument against the patron's note, trying to force the stone to conform to a standard of absolute, unassailable rightness. Yet the harder he scrubbed at the grain, the rougher and more pitted the stone surface became under his hands. His jaw handled the phantom tension of 100 imaginary debates, his skull joints radiating a dry, coarse heat as he desperately tried to litigate his value through the sheer physical friction of his tools. The master mason of the upper valley was Sosei, a silent carver whose hair had turned the gray shade of river shale, and whose hands held the patient, heavy stability of the bedrock beneath the cliffs. Sosei did not rely on long verbal explanations to convey the principles of form and space, spending his days quietly splitting granite blocks with small iron wedges or oiling the wooden levers so they would not splinter under the load. He had been quietly monitoring the progressive tightening of Shaka's upper body, tracking the dry, rhythmic scraping sound echoing from the carver's bench since the early autumn frost arrived. On an evening when the mountain wind had died down completely, leaving the valley below the ledge wrapped in a seamless, silent sea of white fog, Master Sosei walked into the dark workspace. The loft was entirely quiet, save for the faint rhythmic drip of condensation sliding from the eaves onto the stone step outside. In the center of the cedar trestle, resting under the pale light of an oil wick, lay the disputed slab, its surface now deeply scarred and hollowed by Shaku's aggressive, dry scrubbing. Shaku stood over the wood, his knuckles white around the volcanic pumice, his jaw clenched as he prepared to strike the stone once more out of sheer, exhausted frustration. The apprentice froze as the master approached, his shoulders rising defensively, the thick heat behind his neck flaring as he anticipated a severe reprimand for damaging the material. Shaku assumed he was about to be expelled from the shed for his lack of control, his internal arguments instantly rushing to the surface to prove that the grain had been faulty from the very first strike of the mallet. Master Sosei did not pick up a chisel, and he did not point out the ruined dimensions of the lintel. Instead, he reached out his rough palm, tapped the flat surface of the pumice stone Shaku was clutching, and asked the young carver to notice if the stone was resisting the tool, or if the carver was resisting the natural architecture of the rock out of pride. Shaku looked down at the volcanic pumice, the sharp, porous edges of the tool biting into the calluses of his fingers, his breath catching in his throat with a sudden deep wave of emotional recognition. The slab was no longer a flat, functional lintel, because he had been treating the rock as an adversary that had to be conquered to validate his worth. His frantic friction had dug a deep, permanent hollow that no amount of scrubbing could ever fill. He looked up at the master mason, his voice catching with an unspent, bitter sorrow as he confessed that he had ruined the piece by trying to force the blemish to disappear, letting his pride turn a simple critique into a war against the stone itself, he admitted, his jaw joints trembling against the weight of the realization that his own head felt exactly like this scarred tablet, a hot, rigid surface where he had been grinding his energy against an unchangeable reality, believing that if he stopped the friction, he would be admitting that he was completely worthless as a builder. The old mason took the flat pumice stone from Shaka's hand, placed it quietly on the edge of the workbench, and reached down to lift a small iron oil pot used to seal the finished carvings. Without using any words, Sosei poured a few clear drops of the pine oil directly into the deep, scarred hollow that Shaku had ground into the basalt, watching the dark liquid pool quietly within the groove, transforming the uneven, pitted flaw into a deep, reflective surface that mirrored the quiet light of the oil dish. The master looked at the apprentice and told him that the transformation of the stone mason does not require every slab to be perfectly uniform, nor does it require the village patron to understand the labor of the chisel. Sosei pointed out that the blemish was merely a configuration of form in a changing world. The suffering arrived when the hand refused to let the stone be uneven, treating a simple variation as a fatal threat to the soul. Shaku stood perfectly still on the dirt floor, the clean, resinous aroma of the pine oil settling deep into his chest as he made one small, profound shift in his relationship with his labor. He paused, took a single, unhurried breath before his mind could repeat the old defense speech, and simply sat with the scarred reality of the tablet. He stopped the habit of treating his defensive thoughts as absolute truths, uncurling his fingers from the bench and allowing his shoulders to drop away from his ears without needing to fix the blemish tonight. The lintel was uneven, the patron's note was harsh, and the loss was real. But he finally stopped using his own physical jaw as a tool to grind away the past. This was the subtle awakening, a quiet realization that the stone carver remains whole and capable whether the work is praised or returned, standing secure within a wide, unmeasured presence that no critical word can ever fracture. As the midnight fog rolled closer to the threshold of the shed, the thick heat at the base of his skull began to cool, letting his awareness return to the simple, stable reality of the floorboards beneath his feet. He recognized that his true nature was not the pristine, unblemished carving he had been striving so fiercely to produce, but the enduring space of the shed itself, which held the chips, the scars, and the silence without ever being broken by the wind. When we allow our attention to settle into the quiet spaces of our own Latinite reflections, we begin to decode the hidden emotional engine that converts the natural fatigue of life into an ongoing sentence of internal friction. We often assume that our physical exhaustion is a direct consequence of the visible tasks we performed, or the actual hours we spent managing our outward responsibilities. But if you observe the thick, rough heat currently situated right along the outer edges of your jaw joints, you will find that the real consumer of your vitality is the continuous, hidden act of resistance. It is the energetic strain of refusing to let the natural texture of life remain uneven, the desperate attempt to manipulate the fluid uncertainty of the world through the frantic application of your own suffering. We treat our minds as an active laboratory of defense, continuously replaying the past and rebuilding the ruined stone with the memory of every perceived shortcoming, operating under the tragic delusion that if we keep our inner core raw and alert, we will somehow secure our worth against the changing opinions of others. This is the exact point where we can begin to separate the original weight of existence from the elaborate psychological armor the mind builds on top of it. Buddhist wisdom approaches this dilemma with a beautiful, direct distinction between the first pain and the second pain. The first pain is simply the raw, unpolished impact of being alive in a world constructed out of unpredictable interactions and natural human limitations. It is the sudden arrival of a harsh evaluation. It is the natural vulnerability of carrying a heavy investment in a shared craft or communication. It is the simple reality of being a human who feels doubt, frustration, or sadness when an encounter leaves an uncorrected misunderstanding in your history. These occurrences are genuinely heavy, yes, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable weather of our daily reality. We cannot control the arrival of the first pain, for the sudden critical note from the valley does not ask the permission of the stone carver before it sends the tablet back to the cedar trestle. The true torment begins when our thoughts take that first pain and knead it into a permanent moral identity, actively constructing the second pain out of our own resistance. The second pain is the elaborate mental trial we host right along our skull base and neck muscles, where we translate a temporary pattern of interpersonal friction into a definitive commentary on our absolute value. We do not simply notice that we are feeling dismissed or empty. The mind turns inward and whispers, "Because you could not convince this person, you are fundamentally inadequate, fraudulent, and banned from true peace." We do not just navigate an intense period of silence, our thoughts declare. This scarred sandstone mortar is proof that your core is inherently defective. This is the mechanism of turning a temporary uneven grain into a solid identity, the unfortunate habit of mistaking a natural empty basin for an absolute pocket of rot that must be scrubbed away with frantic, dry labor. When we exist within this pattern of self-judgment, our awareness spends its Latinite hours rehearsing the future and replaying the past, frantically attempting to build a wall of hypervigilance against the terrifying landscape of human vulnerability. We stay awake repeating every word we spoke during the conflict, because we believe that our burning regret is a form of protection, that if we keep the inner dialogue sharp and critical, we will somehow force ourselves to be perfectly unassailable tomorrow. We develop an insatiable need for internal approval, trying to fix the self through a subtle application of shame, using our self-punishment as a temporary payment to satisfy the internal prosecutor we carry in our skin. But trying to heal your exhausted spirit through the accumulation of mental friction is like trying to preserve a scarred tablet. By grinding it tighter with a rough volcanic pumice, the pits remain trapped in the center, waiting to restrict your natural breathing the moment the light fades. True inner transformation does not manifest because you have finally forced every single flaw to disappear from your character through sheer willpower. It begins with the radical, quiet realization that peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is an entirely different relationship with the difficulty itself. It is the willingness to stand in the damp stonecarver's shed without immediately picking up the heavy tool to strike your own neck. When you allow the reality of the returned work to exist without transforming it into an absolute verdict on your soul, you are stopping the second pain before it can plant its roots in your body. You are choosing to sit quietly among the cedar beams in the dark, letting the grain be uneven and letting the inner room be vast, without needing to apologize to the universe for the lack of symmetry running through your foundation. As you let the frame support the heavy framework of your chest right now, notice how the desperate urge to appear perfectly resolved begins to lose its grip when it is met with simple, non-judgmental presence. You do not have to settle the record of your entire interpersonal standing before the night ends, and you do not need to guarantee that your clarity will be fully restored by tomorrow morning. The path toward inner freedom does not ask you to become a magically perfect statue who never experiences the sting of doubt or criticism. It simply requires the very small, very steady discipline of noticing the hot knot along your jaw hinges, naming it as the old defensive pretense, and refusing to give its declarations the authority of truth. You are the vast, open workspace that holds both the raw basalt and the quiet oil pot. You are not the scarred stone dust that is currently dropping away in the dark. In a moment, this gentle insight will move even closer to the small, ordinary triggers of your modern life, showing us how to carry this soft hand into the waking world without guilt. But for now, let your attention sink down into the quiet, unmoving center of your chest junction. Let your lower collarbones expand outward on their own natural rhythm, taking up all the space they require in the indigo shadows, completely free from the narrow metrics of outward performance. You are safe enough to drop the protective armor right here, leaving your spirit as unpolished, wide, and supportive as the heavy floorboards before the first stone slab was ever dragged across their surface. Now let this quiet understanding step softly across the centuries, moving out of the silent mountain stone sheds and directly into the small electric friction of your ordinary evening. The dry sandstone mortar and the scarred volcanic slab we have been exploring are not abstract concepts designed to live only within an old monastic archive. They are the exact configurations of energy you hold down in your jaw joints and your upper neck when you lie awake at midnight, staring at the blank screen of your phone, waiting for a text message or a work notification that might validate your choices or offer a temporary reassurance that you have not permanently failed the social expectation. We live so much of our modern lives inside this digital hypervigilance, repeatedly checking our devices for an external metric of our worth, replaying a minor conversational mistake or an uncorrected disagreement, as if the sheer force of our anxiety could somehow rewrite the reality of our day. We perform the role of the unshakable builder during the daylight hours, smiling warmly while feeling an immense heavy thickness inside our chest, carrying the constant worry that we are fundamentally falling behind our peers, or that our true, unpolished self is simply not enough to sustain our connections. You can begin to transform this exhausting mechanism right in the middle of the very moments that cause your breathing to shallow, recognizing that peace is not an Alornothing victory, but a quality practiced in the smallest, most unexceptional slivers of the day. When you find yourself caught in the frantic urge to control a relationship, check your notifications for reassurance, or fear the absolute uncertainty of the future, you are fully permitted to pause. A single slow breath taken before you offer an answer or look at your screen is a profound form of wisdom. It is a quiet, somatic realization that not every self-critical thought deserves your immediate obedience, and not every heavy feeling is an absolute command that must be followed into a Latinite internal courtroom. You can care deeply about the people in your life without gripping the dry tools so tightly that you tear the skin of your own spirit. You are simply stepping out into the wide room of your own presence, letting the dusty residue of your daily interactions pass over your mind, without allowing it to compromise the permanent, load-bearing foundation of your true stone cellar. Perhaps you have spent years operating under the hidden law that your right to rest must be bought with a continuous display of flawless emotional stability, and that wanting to let your eyes close while your inner difficulties remain unresolved is a form of guilt-ridden failure. We treat our rest as a luxury that must be earned through absolute competence, fearing that if we stop carrying the weight of the lintel or analyzing our vulnerability, we will be left completely exposed in the dark. But the rough sandstone does not feel a shred of remorse for holding only an empty basin, and the raw cedar beams do not apologize to the ridge for letting their space remain empty under the fog. You can rest without earning it first. Your exhaustion is not a moral debt that must be settled through hours of overthinking. It is simply the natural voice of an internal posture that has run out of vital energy from trying to grind an unchangeable reality into compliance through sheer force of will. It is entirely possible to navigate your modern daily realities, the unsaid arguments, the critical text messages, and the uneven paths without allowing the lack of external validation to crush your own jaw junction. When we attempt to control the past or hide our natural fatigue through the continuous application of our own shame, we are acting like Shaku before his hands were uncurled, refusing to let the reality of the scarred stone exist as a natural configuration of a vast shifting world. True inner freedom begins when you allow your living biography to be offered to the universe with a loose, receptive hand. You can maintain your daily responsibilities, contemplate your growth, or rest your body with the simple, unforced presence of raw stone, letting the surface pattern exist without demanding that it match a standard of absolute perfection. The next time the creeping burning of exhaustion settles deep into your neck muscles, when you find yourself comparing your hidden, tired routine to the manufactured triumphs of those around you, look down at the quiet weight of your own posture and take a slow breath. The doubt you hid or the explanation you could not deliver is merely the external weather of a long, unpredictable human existence. You do not have to pretend the internal void did not feel heavy, and you do not have to force an immediate state of complete transformation before the raw edge of your exhaustion has even cooled. It is completely enough to sit with the uncertainty of your own unfinished healing, letting the irregular fragments of your day rest on the bench without needing to stamp them with the label of permanent ruin. In a few moments, the remaining definitions and standards of the daylight hours will dissolve entirely into the dark, leaving nothing but the vast protective space of this midnight room. As your limbs prepare to surrender their final defensive postures, release the illusion that you must secure every single boundary of your public identity before you are permitted to let your jaw drop open. The expectations of the day carry no authority in this quiet sanctuary, and the unresolved demands can remain suspended in the cool mist outside your window. Let your attention drop back down into the steady, unhurried rise and fall of your lower lungs, knowing that the load-bearing substance of your true nature is already fully intact, completely wide, and entirely at peace. The dark hour has fully arrived now, and the quiet gravity of the night is settling over your bed like the thick, unmoving mist that holds the upper mountain terraces in absolute stillness. Every single effort you made today, every tireless defense you tried to build beneath your jaw joints, and every anxious reach for reassurance has dropped its momentum, dissolving into the silence of this indigo-shadowed room. The heavy, unalterable expectations of the distant market valley are no longer pulling at your neck muscles. They have slid away, falling through the floorboards into the damp earth, leaving your internal vault completely empty, spacious, and calm. Your jaw hinges and your upper neck are sinking a fraction of an inch deeper into the surface beneath you, as if the heavy stone of your inner nature were finally remembering its relationship with the steady, load-bearing foundation of the deep cedar beams. Let your breathing become very small, very quiet, and entirely effortless. There is absolutely no need to regulate the air as it moves down through your throat. The body knows how to expand and soften on its own time, like the slow, steady movement of the mountain rain passing directly through the open framework of the stonecarver's shed. With every long, unheard release of breath, the distinct, rough heat that you held across your skull base is letting go of its grip. The discordant lines of your unfinished confrontations are no longer being tracked or verified by an internal court case. The heavy stone pestles have been laid down on the slate, the unpolished volcanic slabs are resting in the shade, and the critical merchant voices have completely vanished beneath a blanket of silent, protective dark. You have permission to stop solving your life for tonight. The dry sandstone mortars, the uneven stone grains, and the strategies for tomorrow do not require your presence while the ridge is cold. They can remain suspended in the shadows outside your window, completely separate from the living form that is resting here in the quiet. You are under no obligation to repair your entire biography before your eyes are allowed to close. You are permitted to be unwritten, unpolished, and completely finished with the labor, resting within the safe sanctuary of an uncompromised night that asks for no conceptual victories before it offers you its blanket of rest. The teaching of the quiet stone is settling deep into the marrow of your bones now, filling the heavy spaces across your neck with an enveloping tenderness. You are returning home to the pristine silence that was always waiting beneath your desire to secure the flawless argument, the vast, unmeasured awareness that cannot be fractured because it belongs to the raw, uncarved bedrock of your own presence. Let the universe carry its own silent turning for the next few hours, while your spirit drifts further away from the language of endless friction and transactional approval. Your jaw is loose, your core is heavy like a dark terrace block resting in the rain, and the still rhythm of the evening is cradling your weary body as you prepare to slide away into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. What if the true purpose of the heavy stone basin is not to grind until every dry corner is defeated, but to sit perfectly empty, wet and silent under the midnight sky? The rain that slides along the deep grooves of the outer terrace blocks does not ask the sky to justify the storm. Nor does the dark soil beneath the grass apologize to the ridge for sitting heavy through the long freeze of winter. All the residual, hot vibrations that gathered along your neck during the hours of tracking, who spoke without fairness, the exhaustion of trying to anticipate the hidden defenses of everyone around you, and the subtle, heavy guilt of leaving an interaction forever broken, all of it is dissolving into the deep, unmoving shadow of this midnight room. The internal mechanism that keeps your jaw guarded is running out of momentum because there is no adversary left to convince, no viewpoint to secure with your fatigue, and no moral code that declares your exhaustion a defect. You are simply here, a physical frame releasing its breath into the dark, completely separate from the public utility you wore during the daylight hours. When we observe this deep inner clearing through a quiet and unhurried awareness, we discover that true peace is not a reward earned by successfully fixing every single dynamic that drained your spirit. It is the radical, simple freedom of changing your relationship with the depletion itself, allowing the internal landscape to remain empty for a season, without transforming that empty space into a personal indictment. The mind creates the second wound when it takes the raw, physical fatigue of an overextended system and wraps it in a narrative of failure, whispering that you must continuously perform your righteousness to be worthy of a place in the dark. But the subterranean spring does not count the jars drawn from its depth, and the dark earth beneath the orchard roots does not check the health of the branches before it agrees to hold them steady through the frost. You are allowed to be empty. You are allowed to let the fire go completely out without believing that the vessel has been ruined. Think of how much vitality has been spent in the late night hours trying to perfect your responses, replaying the moments where you felt misunderstood, or trying to guarantee that your boundaries will be perfectly unshakable tomorrow. That continuous mental architecture, that defensive looping that treats every interpersonal friction as an emergency that must be solved before you sleep, is the very weight that leaves your chest wall feeling so thin and brittle. But tonight, the mountain trails are quiet, and the village wells are still. The validation you failed to secure or the frustration you hid is merely a temporary ripple in a long, complex life of human connections, entirely unable to alter the profound, load-bearing awareness that is cradling your shoulders right now. You do not have to settle the accounts of your relationships before you rest, and you do not need to feel whole before you let your eyes close. Let your focus drop even deeper now, leaving the narrative of your modern tasks behind and settling fully into the heavy, immovable center of your lower core. Feel the quiet, supportive mass of your body as it gives its entire weight to the stillness beneath you, perfectly held by an ancient natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of human performance. The deep masonry foundations have held the cold stone through countless freezes, without needing to generate a single spark of heat to prove their value, and your system is fully capable of resting in that exact same unlit security tonight. Every digital notification, every unreciprocated favor, and every expectation of absolute strength can remain suspended in the cool evening air outside, completely powerless to reach into this dark sanctuary. The movement of your breath is becoming so slow, so thin, and so unforced that it feels like nothing more than the faint rhythmic rustle of dry reed grass along the edge of a frozen stream when the wind has completely died away. There is no longer any separation between the immense, dark space of the cellar and the stillness that is expanding within the framework of your bones. The worries that were spinning through your mind a few hours ago have turned into pale, translucent mist, dissolving into the wide, unconditioned landscape of your presence without leaving a single fracture behind. You are returning to the native, untroubled sanctuary that existed long before you ever learned to measure your worth by your utility, the silent, unpolished room where you are already wide, already safe, and already deeply at peace. Let the final definitions and roles of the day fall away into the floorboards, leaving your spirit as unmapped, cool and silent as the unglazed clay sitting in the deep earth. There are no expectations to satisfy, no oil levels to compute, and no versions of your devotion to defend in this beautiful, protective dark. The world will manage its own weights without your illumination for the next few hours, and the morning will bring its own design when the light is ready. But right now, in this single pocket of pure presence, nothing is required of your chest but the simple willingness to let the lamp go dark and rest. Let your mind dissolve completely into the heavy, rhythmic peace of your body, allowing your weary soul to slide effortlessly into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. The cool mountain air continues to brush against the outer stone walls, carrying the quiet rhythm of the late night deep into the marrow of your bones, filling the heavy spaces across your neck with a profound, unhurried tenderness. You are returning home to the pristine silence that was always waiting beneath your desire to secure the flawless argument, the vast, unmeasured awareness that cannot be fractured because it belongs to the raw, uncarved bedrock of your own presence. Let the universe carry its own silent turning for the next few hours, while your spirit drifts further away from the language of endless friction and transactional approval. Your jaw is loose. Your core is heavy like a dark terrace block resting in the rain, and the still rhythm of the evening is cradling your weary body as you prepare to slide away into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. When we observe this deep, inner clearing through a quiet and unhurried awareness, we discover that true peace is not a reward earned by successfully fixing every single dynamic that drained your spirit. It is the radical, simple freedom of changing your relationship with the depletion itself, allowing the internal landscape to remain empty for a season, without transforming that empty space into a personal indictment. The mind creates the second wound when it takes the raw physical fatigue of an overextended system and wraps it in a narrative of failure. whispering that you must continuously perform your righteousness to be worthy of a place in the dark. But the subterranean spring does not count the jars drawn from its depth, and the dark earth beneath the orchard roots does not check the health of the branches before it agrees to hold them steady through the frost. You are allowed to be empty. You are allowed to let the fire go completely out without believing that the vessel has been ruined. Think of how much vitality has been spent in the late night hours trying to perfect your responses, replaying the moments where you felt misunderstood, or trying to guarantee that your boundaries will be perfectly unshakable tomorrow. That continuous mental architecture, that defensive looping that treats every interpersonal friction as an emergency that must be solved before you sleep, is the very weight that leaves your chest wall feeling so thinned and brittle. But tonight, the mountain trails are quiet, and the village wells are still. The validation you failed to secure or the frustration you hid is merely a temporary ripple in a long, complex life of human connections, entirely unable to alter the profound, load-bearing awareness that is cradling your shoulders right now. You do not have to settle the accounts of your relationships before you rest, and you do not need to feel whole before you let your eyes close. Let your focus drop even deeper now, leaving the narrative of your modern tasks behind and settling fully into the heavy, immovable center of your lower core. Feel the quiet, supportive mass of your body as it gives its entire weight to the stillness beneath you, perfectly held by an ancient natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of human performance. The deep masonry foundations have held the cold stone through countless freezes without needing to generate a single spark of heat to prove their value, and your system is fully capable of resting in that exact same unlit security tonight. Every digital notification, every unreciprocated favor, and every expectation of absolute strength can remain suspended in the cool evening air outside, completely powerless to reach into this dark sanctuary. The movement of your breath is becoming so slow, so thin, and so unforced that it feels like nothing more than the faint rhythmic rustle of dry reed grass along the edge of a frozen stream when the wind has completely died away. There is no longer any separation between the immense, dark space of the cellar and the stillness that is expanding within the framework of your bones. The worries that were spinning through your mind a few hours ago have turned into pale, translucent mist, dissolving into the wide, unconditioned landscape of your presence without leaving a single fracture behind. You are returning to the native, untroubled sanctuary that existed long before you ever learned to measure your worth by your utility. The silent, unpolished room where you are already wide, already safe, and already deeply at peace. Let the final definitions and roles of the day fall away into the floorboards, leaving your spirit as unmapped, cool and silent as the unglazed clay sitting in the deep earth. There are no expectations to satisfy, no oil levels to compute, and no versions of your devotion to defend in this beautiful, protective dark. The world will manage its own weights without your illumination for the next few hours, and the morning will bring its own design when the light is ready. But right now, in this single pocket of pure presence, nothing is required of your chest but the simple willingness to let the lamp go dark and rest. Let your mind dissolve completely into the heavy, rhythmic peace of your body, allowing your weary soul to slide effortlessly into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep.